Beyond the Fence Line, a podcast brought to you by the Texas Agricultural Land Trust. Created by landowners for landowners, we're proud to play a role in conserving the Texas legacy of wide open spaces.
Well, welcome back, listeners, to Beyond the Fence Line, a podcast brought to you by the Texas Agricultural Land Trust. Whether you're a landowner, wildlife enthusiast, conservation professional, or just curious about the future of our working lands, you're in the right place. I'm Chad Ellis, the CEO of TALT, and glad you're here. Today, I'm joined by my good friend and respected partner in conservation and partner in crime, Mr. James Clement, the Senior Vice President and General Manager of Grass and Rangeland of the Earth Optics. James and his team are doing some truly innovative work at this intersection of technology and land stewardship, and looking forward to kind of diving into that conversation. Also joining us, that also kind of keeps James in line is Ryan Dierking, the director of Northern Rangeland. He's also a producer of Missouri. And James, Ryan, glad you guys got to join us.
Thank you very much.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, thank you, both for being here today, and I really appreciate you taking the time to share the insights to our audience. And I think we're at this, kind of intersection, right? Of, I kind of sit there thinking today, driving into San Antonio to work and seeing, all these people and all the pressures that we've had, as producers. I mean, it's just like we've never seen it before. And, I'd like to really love to kind of just dive in, ask the question to both of you. I mean, what do you see the biggest challenges that we have as producers to keep this freedom to operate? And then I kind of really love to kind of dive into, some of the things that you guys are providing that I think is, key for us as producers and Earth Optics and kind of into that. So James, you want to kind of kick it off? And
Yeah, so both sides of my family have been ranching a long time in Texas. Beggar's Cattle Company on my mother's side since 1876, and King Ranch, my dad's side, since 1853. I worked in the Marine Corps and ranches, on family ranches, and then ranches in other parts of the world and the country. And I met our CEO, Lars Dierud, on a job when I spent 10 years at King Ranch running the horse program, and then was doing landman work. And King Ranch was doing, along with Exxon-funded study with B. Carbon and Jim Blackburn on 16 ranches across the Midwest, just trying to get an overall baseline study. And at the time, I also ranch on my own in South Texas with friends of yours, Pancho Ortega, Jr., Sr., and then also my wife and I own some of our own cows, and my siblings too. And I was exploring this whole carbon credit space on our personal lands. And I was driving around. Lars, the space physicist, and I heard all these people selling and kind of bringing these lands together to sell large scale credits to these big companies. But I didn't realize that an independent company was taking all the data, and that was Earth Optics. And so I spent a week with him in the truck and side by side, just asking him all sorts of questions personally, because I was going to sign a contract, but also just about how we gather the data and how all the technology works. And a couple months later, I asked him for a job, and I told him that the landman was really the person that developed the oil and gas business in Texas 100 years ago. It was the person with the personal relationships with ranches, and kind of knew the landscape and could translate the technical and the industry kind of words about all this space into something that would make sense for a rancher. And I thought, if there's a spot I want to be in this world, not to mention this whole idea, these ecosystem markets and these natural resource opportunities that are out there, I love the idea of paying people to be better stewards. and how does that work? And I know, Chad, that's you and I have talked a lot about it, and Ryan and I, since we've known each other these last 6 months, are all very in tune to this, because everything else in the history of ranching is how many cows can you graze, or how many crops can you farm, or how many pump jacks, how many renewable solar panels or wind or turbines. And this was, I feel like this is the beginning of, or we're not at the beginning, I guess we're in the moment where we can really scale this whole idea of how do we take care of land, and those that take care of land get paid for it, and the better you do, the more you get paid for it based on the good works that they're doing for their ecosystems. And so I just really like being in this seat of, at the crossroads of the buyers, the verifiers, and I know we'll discuss all these things, and I'm sure your audience is pretty savvy, but how all these people are presenting this to the world, and how do we translate that into just being better ranchers and getting paid for that. And so that,
Yeah, I mean, y
you know,
yeah, I think I mean, that's spot on, James, and I think you're right. I mean, I there's this, and I think right, and a lot of it is this disconnect to agriculture and land stewardship and really what it means, right? And I think unfortunately, for, 100 years, right, stewardship isn't free, right? It costs blood, sweat, and tears and a lot of money and capital as land managers and landowners and land stewards to implement land stewardship. But from a society component, we have this disconnect, and we don't understand where our water comes from, right? And Lyndon B. Johnson, I think, said it the best, James. He said, "Soil and water conservation starts where the first raindrop falls." Right, and that's on your ranch, or other ranchers and stewards across the state, and that's where our water comes from, and that stewardship's important. And how do we empower those stewards to be better stewards, and be better tomorrow than they are today? And yeah, so I'm excited. I remember years ago, at that time, I helped, as you guys know, helped start up the Ecosystem Service Market Consortium when I was at Noble, and I remember Lars starting up Earth Optics, and I was like, man, this guy's got it figured out, right? And just needed time and momentum, and excited to see the team that he's brought together here at Earth Optics, and to bring solutions for us as producers. Uh, Ryan, I mean, what are your thoughts? I mean, James and I are here talking about Texas, but what about Missouri, and kind of what's going on your neck of the woods and kind of the northern part of our range lands that you're facing and dealing with those landowners?
Yeah, I appreciate the question there. Yeah, I think there's unique circumstances across different regions of the US, and all of them have their opportunities and their different challenges. I guess just to give a little bit of back context to myself, as James did, grew up in East Central Missouri, about an hour west of St. Louis in the northern Ozark region there. Missouri being the number 3 cow-calf producing state in the US. And one of the things that we have in Missouri is a lot of cows, but they are on numerous operations. So Missouri, while it has lots of cattle, it has lots of small operators, unlike, a lot of ranches in Texas and in the western part of the US. Um, Part of my background in Missouri has been growing up on our cattle operation. We have about 100 head, which is a medium-sized operation for the state. Went to the University of Missouri, studied pasture management, the cattle and pasture interface at the university there, and did a bachelor's, master's, and for my PhD, I did a joint project actually with the Noble Foundation down in Ardmore, Oklahoma. The last 5 years of my career I've spent at Indigo Ag doing R&D work uh, in the sustainability landscape. So I was doing on-farm research with ranchers or growers across the Midwest, trying to understand these practices and what impacts it has. And and then from there, I came over to Earth Optics and have been working with James for the last 6 months. And so, I have a very unique intersection of both croplands and how those function, as well as the cattle space. And when we look at different parts of the U.S., right? Not only just the northern areas where we deal with a lot of cold, right? So we have long winters in that area, and how do we implement those practices, during those cold, long winter months, and how do we frame that management when we get out west and we get out into Nevada and Utah? How do we deal with low rainfall areas, and can we talk about carbon markets or sustainability markets in the same way as you would, let's say, in eastern Texas? And then when you get out further east, where, like I said, our operation is in Missouri, and you think about Kentucky and Tennessee is in the top, I think, top 10 producers of cattle, right? We deal with a lot of small operations. And so how do we think about those markets? And those challenges are going to be unique for each individual operation. And one of the aspects of these markets is data. And so how, when you think about a large ranch, as James comes from at King Ranch, they've been looking at data and how they track animals and where the cattle are grazing. But a lot of small operations haven't been doing that. And in fact, on our operation, even though we've been doing rotational grazing since about 2007, before it was actually, I guess, boutique or in the know of doing these types of practices, we didn't capture any of that data, right? I mean, we had our bulls, and we had cows out there, and we track, our conception rates, but we weren't actually tracking where we were keeping cattle on which pastures for how long, and how much residual was behind. And so as we go into these carbon markets and sustainability markets, there is going to be a data threshold, right? There's going to be requirements and requests from these agencies or project developers that are going to be asking for you to monitor your rangelands. How many cattle were on this pasture at what time of year, and how long did they graze? And so those types of questions that are being asked from these producers are some of the things that individuals or families that want to join one of these carbon markets, either in an offset or an inset market, and I'm sure we'll get into those a little bit later, we'll have to think about, what is the type of data we're collecting now? What is the type of data we're going to be collecting in the future? And how do we implement that on our operation? So,
Yeah. Thanks, Ryan. I mean, before we kind of get into the markets and insetting and offsetting and kind of get into those weeds, I really want to dive a little bit more into the data, right? And this conversation, because, I kind of think it's one of these things we overlook and, right? I mean, James, I'm sure, you know, like me or others, right, is like we have the data, and Ryan, like you said, we have the grazing plan. It's a lot of it's in our head, right? It's just not on paper or on, software or things of that nature. We have data written on the back end of a Copenhagen can, and record books and, calendars and things like scattered and, on our dashboard of the truck. Um, but I mean, I mean, there's an important component, right? Beyond the markets that you mentioned, Ryan, of these requirements, but there's aspects of that data and that data collection that are helping us make better decisions and being able to see those decisions and being able to see an economic return just on management. And I really want to kind of hear from y'all's perspective. And I think, I'll just kind of stop there because this is a really important piece, I think, that no one really discusses. So, James, your
Yeah,
thoughts on
sure. I guess that's where, our COO Adam at one point said, we want to get to where we don't have to take a sample anymore.
Mhm.
The original name of our company was Ground Truth. So a lot of this started out in modeling, right? Whereas desktop analysis purely. And we always thought it was important not only to take actual soil samples combined with imagery, combined with above ground photos that you've seen in any NRCS project, et cetera. But then also we've got a ground penetrating radar too. That's a patented implement that creates more accurate soil maps as well. And so as we gather the data, then we also have the largest DNA and the largest soil carbon library in the world. So every acre, every sample we take, we are able to refine a better model where I don't think we'll ever get to where we don't have to take a sample anymore. But at least we're getting to a point where we're more and more accurate. We have a better and better. I mean, I see a future one day where somebody buys a piece of land with no historical knowledge. Because Chad, as you know, with all the people you work with, that the biggest thing is, maybe these lessons aren't passed down, or if there's a new owner, they spend weeks at coffee shops and classes and signing up for webinars, like trying to figure out just what is appropriate for their region and even for whatever business they're in, if that's farm or rangeland, et cetera. And, and the fact we get to a place where we could say, hey, based on the soil data, based on the historical analysis, based on all the information that we are gathering, we are able to model of like, what does this look like in terms of what's the best productivity based on your rainfall, based on your soil type, et cetera. And that's Earth Optics really started as that, right? And a company that was focused on how to make people make better, faster decisions on their land. That carbon and all these markets became an offshoot of that, because it's like, well, if we can quantify all of that and we can currently monetize the carbon, why can't we monetize all these other things? And so we're running multiple races at the same time in terms of the data management. It's what can we gather? What can we learn from it? How can we make a better decision instead of spending 40 years trying to do what's right? And then right about the time you're retiring, you've really figured out how to ranch in your part of the world. And so that's another reason why I like being here. It's just giving people those tools at the lowest possible cost, at a truly scalable price, because a lot of ranchers will just think that, farmers have been taking soil data for a number of years, but we feel like we've got more tools for them to utilize. But then on the ranch side, it's, hey, what can we give to the rancher to make that person become more effective sooner, so that they don't spend all those years learning from the hard truths and from mistakes. And they're going to make mistakes. We all are. But it's like, how do we try to make less mistakes that everybody else is making over and over? And so I think that's a big part of it. But Ryan, I'll hand it over to you too, in terms of just your technical expertise on this subject.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I mean, a lot of what James talks about is right on target, right? We can go into a lot of depth here, but realistically speaking, most of um what James is alluding to here is your ranch is going to be context dependent, right? You can't change the geography of where your ranch and your cattle operation is situated. You are given a certain context of what is your soil type, meaning the sand, silt, clay contents of your soil. You're given an environmental condition of what is the amount of rainfall, what is the temperatures you're going to be receiving in a given year, and what is the forage base that you have. Now, within that context, how do you best utilize those resources and the management of those cattle to maximize your sustainability footprint in some ways, right? So you can look at it from a diversity aspect. So like, how do you think about bird species or invertebrates, or different carrying capacities of exotic wildlife that may be there, or native wildlife, or the cattle that you're grazing. And so taking all of that together, what James is alluding to is essentially we can take a lot of those factors and model out what would be a likely scenario if you are managing your ranch in a particular manner, and what would be the upside of that management practice for carbon credit generation and possible payments that would come from that. And I think that's essentially what James is alluding to in all of that is you have that given footprint. What does that mean for your ranch?
Yeah, I think too, Ryan, I appreciate both y'all's kind of, thoughts around this. And, I want to kind of add a little bit more from my perspective and the importance of data, and a couple of things too, right? There's a, really dear friend of mine, and, I look at her as a mentor, and just great cattleman in her own right, is Debbie Lyons Blythe. Ranches kind of in tall grass prairie in Kansas. And, I was visiting with her a few years ago as she's, starting to have kids coming back from college and coming back to the ranch. She was just like a lot of us, right? Her grazing plans were in her heads, and then she started working with the kids, and she really, kind of hit home to me one time in a discussion where she started really putting that information on paper, right? And the data collection. And she's like, that is our succession plan. Our succession plan is not just, kind of the ins and outs, but it's really the data and the understanding and the planning and all of that on paper because, that history. And you were kind of saying this, James, right? We're trying to work 40 years to kind of figure it out in the system. How do we pass that on to the next generation to help, empower them? And it comes down to this data collection. And I think for my own self, right, and is like, I sit down and we're kind of figuring out the business and the budget of the business for the next year. The last couple of years, I've been trying to really like intentionally say how much money and time and effort am I going to put into this data collection, right? And that there's an investment on that from a succession planning, but also setting up the stage for future markets too, where we can start collecting data and be able to capture that information um, to be able to enter some of those markets and not lose some of those returns. And we can dive right into that. The other thing is the other piece of the data and planning and all of these things that are bringing back, Ryan, and you probably remember some of this of maybe, some of your joint work with Noble Foundation. When I worked at Noble Foundation, we kind of, again, was that consulting and working with landowners. And a lot of that was helping, put the plan and the data collection and all of this on paper and, putting that together through that work. And, you know, land stewards were able to make better decisions and faster decisions. And through that work, we were seeing on an average, the landowners we were working with were saving $43,000 a year, right? Of making better, timely decisions. And it really started about, data and data collection and analyzing and looking at it. And, $43,000. I mean, that could be in being in the black instead of the red. And so I think we don't look at it that way. And I think unfortunately we don't talk about the multiple facets of data and data collection. And that's where I'm excited with Earth Optics is like, not only can you help, you know, be this part of helping make better decisions and be in the markets, and it's really about stacking these opportunities and layering these, income streams to keep us more successful. But, I don't know. I just think there's nothing better. And I'm excited about what you're doing. And I'm excited, James, like you said, like you guys are working and working hard to minimize the cost, right? Where in the future, you're still going to have measurements, you're still going to have some of those things, but it's going to be, much, not as many, and being able to kind of move into that. So uh, I appreciate y'all's thoughts on that. Well, let's dive into, maybe how this data brings into other, markets. And let's talk about the carbon markets and, who wants to kind of tackle and kind of get us just a brief overview of offsets, insets, and kind of what that looks like.
I'll do a brief one. One thing, like to begin with, is that ranchers have made themselves comfortable with selling their natural resources. Whether that's selling a hunt or even selling water off the place.
Right.
And what I love about these markets is like we are paying you to keep it, and we're paying you to maintain it and improve it. And that's again, I can't hit on that enough. Like that's so rare in terms of the history of American ranching, where somebody is willing to pay you just to continue and to hopefully be better. And and so I mean that's just from the highest possible level. And then on the offset side, yes, I mean it is unlike other uh I guess industrial or mechanical carbon capture or all the other things that your audience might have heard about, is that this is real. The science is real. The data is real. The capture is real. We're promoting the fact that livestock is an improvement on the land. So cattle eating grass, going through the rumen, putting a natural fertilizer back on the soil, their hoof impact, everything the cow does is in defense of with these markets. And then, a big conversation today, and I'm going a little sidetracked here, Chad, but bear with
Oh,
me.
that's good. Yeah.
We keep hearing about the methane emissions of a cow. The methane cycle is a 10-year cycle. It is something that, with the lowest cow herd since 1950 or 47, wherever we are, we are making we have made a more efficient animal, and it gets more efficient every year. Most studies show that there's less four-legged animals in North America today, so there's less methane being emitted, even if that animal is larger, and an animal on its own uh, putting out more methane perhaps as an individual. But again, what are we doing with that? We've never had the efficiencies that we've had today. And so with all that being said, the impact of the animal on the rangeland, the impact of the adjustments to a farm operation for the improvement of the soil and for the improvement of the productivity, we're feeding more people with less. We're being more efficient when we do it. And so again, just a rare time in life where you're developing two things at the same time, that being higher productivity and improved soil health. And so, and that is what we're paying. So you're getting, if you're focusing on these markets, you're actually working yourself into two things, or maybe three things. You're improving the amount of cash flow you can receive from whatever commodity you produce. Two, you're improving the asset overall because you have a higher focus on the improving the land. So if you do ever sell, you're selling something better than you found it, or than was operated in the past, and how it was operated in the past. And then three, on top of that, is that now you're able to sell these carbon credits as offsets. And so, that's, again, I always try to bring it back to, how does it look for a bottom line, like you did with the $43,000 average savings on your project that you mentioned. It's like that I want to keep beating that drum, because that's most important. But Ryan, if you want to kind of go into the scope 3 side, and the variance between that and the offset side, I'd appreciate you chiming in there.
Yeah, happy to do so. I really appreciate your Chad on the data side. Going to graduate school and postdoc and being in R&D, I cannot emphasize enough data. Now, granted, everybody's going to have their own threshold, but I suggest everybody start somewhere. Start on some low-hanging fruit, whether that's, you know, measuring how long your pastures or rest periods between grazing events, how many cows you can, your stocking rates are. Start somewhere. If it were up to me on our operation, we would have probably gizmos and gadgets everywhere monitoring numerous things, but it's it's not always up to me. And granted, there's sort of a return on investment that you got to look at. But I agree. If you're not measuring it, you can't make any improvements. And so that's sort of my motto is, if you're not measuring it, you don't know where you're headed, and you can't make adjustments. And so I really appreciate that insight from you, Chad, on starting somewhere with data collection. As far as what your question there related to these markets, as James kind of alluded to, there was what we would refer to as an offset market. So imagine you have a property boundary. Within that property boundary, you are sequestering X number of tons of carbon, depending on your practices and rainfall and soil texture and all that, as we discussed before. In an inset market, you're essentially selling the credits through the beef that's being sold off the farm. So instead of tying the carbon to the land, you're tying the carbon to the beef. And so now you're looking in an inset market, is what we also can refer to as a scope 3. You have uh, industry partners that are looking to source ag products, whether they be corn, wheat, or in this instance, beef, into their supply chain that has a smaller overall environmental footprint, whether that be measured in CO2 equivalents or some other metric. And and essentially you're tying that to that animal through the supply chain. So, you as a cow calf producer will have some off in excuse me here, you'll have some kind of component related to that inset, and then you have a backgrounder or feedlot or wherever that cow is, that finish animal is going. You will have some kind of metric tied to that animal throughout that process and evaluating its overall carbon footprint, so to say, or so to speak. And in doing so, one of the aspects that Earth Optics is looking at is you have all of these things related to herd genetics, methane emissions. We can go on a few other aspects of that, but that's all on the beef side. But then you have the soil inventory, and so this is where Earth Optics comes into play. Here is not only are you looking at what the animal component is, but we're also looking to tie in that animal component and what its impact is on the land and bring those two together so that you have a full picture of what is taking place as that animal is being raised through the supply chain into that final steak at the supermarket and has some type of value associated with it. Hopefully that's clear as mud, and if not, I'll try and pick it apart a little bit better.
No, thanks, Brian, for kind of, bringing that together. And yeah, I think, all this stuff is right. You don't know what you don't know, right? It's a producer, and there's so many markets and so many things coming. And I think the more important that, I really want us to really hit on is, it starts, I think you said it very well, Ryan. It starts with the data and, what do you collect and, how that starts going into, opportunities of carbon markets. And hopefully, James, we start seeing the day of instead of, the land stewardship or us not getting paid for all these ecosystem services that, we're starting to, hopefully see the markets happen where we're getting paid for, open space and clean water, clean air, all of these different things that we're providing to society on a daily basis, as we kind of move forward.
And Chad, we've seen the explosion of real estate agents in Texas. I mean, the market
Yeah.
to trade land and flip land and to just hold it as an asset is an obvious one. I mean, based on the amount, and it's like, is there anything we can do? And I'm okay with buying ranch land. Like that's great, good for those people. But like, is there anything we can do to help people hold on? Is there anything we can do to recruit a new generation? Because that's something that you and I've talked about a lot. Is like, what
Yep.
you don't know what we don't know what is going to be the reason why somebody stays in agriculture or decides or chooses agriculture. And if we can bring in, where long days on the horse for the tractor or the kind of what people think of. But if we're taking what Ryan was saying and what you're alluding to is just like we can also bring. I mean, now we're seeing people from Silicon Valley move into ag, and we're seeing people from, you know, large VCs and PEs come into agriculture. From an ownership standpoint, not as much from a management standpoint, but I if we can provide a way where we recruit young people to be into the operations side and really learn and whatever that is, whatever gets them into that. And that's why, from a greater ag tech standpoint, right? It's like, hey, I don't know what is going to excite that 12-year-old into being in agriculture, but now we have so many more ways for them to grow into this space. And they might not want to be a cowboy or might not want to farm every day, but at least they want to stay in what is the family business, or at least they want to stay in what is the culture of Texas, right? And culture of America, because agriculture is our culture. I mean, that is
Right.
the founding fathers all the way to the biggest expansions, and that I guess from a larger standpoint, people always say, oh, there's less and less cowboys. Well, I'd point back to us as ranchers and landowners, like we're the reason why the culture is declining. And so how do we recruit people that want to be in this and want to, it's not an easy life, but want to choose this life for reasons outside of, well, that's just what your family does or whatever. And so that, I think that's also something that I'm really I'm trying to champion, I guess, in this other space.
Yeah, and I appreciate all your work in championing it. And, I very much feel the same way and very passionate about it, right? And I mean, to me, it's like, and I've been working on this for 20 years, trying to figure this component here. As we started seeing, especially 20 years ago, more and more people looking at, land as an asset and an investment side, but not necessarily the caretakers or land stewards of that land. And, how can we connect those folks that are buying property and understanding all the values of these ecosystem services? It starts with the data and understanding, you know, those components and putting the right land stewards, right? I mean, if you're a new beginning farmer rancher today, you can't go buy a place and, have an agricultural business and be able to make ends meet. It's just extremely hard. The business is hard as it is already. And then you add that layer, but there's this actually matchmaking component where I think Earth Optics becomes, the matchmaker in a sense where that data and your guys' technology can help start showing, maybe it's soil health and the increase of that land stewardship's increasing the soil health on that property, which is increasing the value of that property for that investor. I mean, to me, we have to think of creative ways and that side of it, like you're saying, James.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree with that. I think it's just gonna take a little bit of time, right? So
Yeah.
the low hanging fruit was soil carbon. That's something that we could measure consistently across different regions and across managements and put it into some kind of context, right? The harder aspect is how do you define soil health in Nevada compared to upstate Michigan? Or how do you quantify bird populations in South Texas versus Florida, right? And so building out those metrics where you're alluding to here is how do we get beyond carbon? How do we get into these ecosystem services? I think it's there's the push there. It's and I've been on several meetings like how do we talk about this? How do we put it into context? And I think it's just going to be a matter of figuring out what is it going to be for particular regions and what is the baseline values that we're going to use to compare against and then finally have to have the buyers willing to make those types of investments in the landscape, in the ranches to do that. But I fully see it coming. As a recent example, I know it's not with soil carbon or birds, but Indigo Ag here about 2 or 3 months ago sold its first water credits to Google. They were building a data center in northeast Oklahoma, and they're wanting to offset some of their water use, right? And so I think as these mature, as these markets mature, as we get more information around what should the landscape look like in a healthy ecosystem, I think those are the types of things that will enable those other markets, in addition to carbon, to come to fruition, really. And how do we look at that at Earth Optics? Well, one way is measuring different components of the soil. So I know we've spent a lot of time talking about soil carbon, but that is just one aspect of it. We also are looking at soil microbiomes. And so how does the microbiology within that soil change as management practice changes? There's been not a lot of studies, but the studies that have been performed show that as you change grazing management practices, the soil biological activity increases dramatically. Okay. Well, we can see that the respiration and the activity increases. What does that look like on a species or in a community aspect, right? When we can actually measure the genetic components within that population and see the shifts in there, right? So can we observe that, in a overgrazed or degraded ecosystem, these are the types of species that are predominant. And then in a system that's managed in a I guess in a more holistic way where you're giving rest and recovery periods, how does that population change? And I think that's where we're on the threshold of really looking at that at Earth Optics. We're also looking at other metrics around soil organic matter that's related to the mineral component as well as particulate matter. So we have other tests beyond just soil carbon that look at the mineral associated components of carbon, which we believe, and a lot of the literature is suggesting, is a long-term storage of that, because those particles are actually binding to the soil carbon. And then you have institutions like the Audubon Society working with project developers like Kateri. They're developing baselines around bird populations. And so, a lot of these things I think are just going to take time to develop.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And I think to me, that's where we need to get, right? Where we're stacking and we need, I think we're getting closer and closer each day, as you said, Ryan, where, we're thinking beyond carbon, right? I mean, to me, carbon was just kind of where we started, but it's really about, the biodiversity and water and, keep stacking these ecosystem services and providing those opportunities. And I also believe, right, not one ecosystem service, not even just carbon is enough money to kind of really push change. It's really about, having value on multiple of those. And then I think the other piece, kind of what you were saying too, that I really feel right. And this is where I think Earth Optics again is crucial into this, is we have to look at and we've been talking about it, during this podcast is, every piece of land is sort of has its own DNA, right? And its own potentials, right? And as you said, like, the potential in Florida and that landscape there looks different even than the neighbor across the fence or, far west Texas. And it, and like, just look at carbon, right? And carbon in Brewster County is going to look different in carbon in Nacogdoches County, right? The potential of carbon. But if we look
Yeah.
at but if we look at the biodiversity side, right? I mean, the stuff in Brewster County, far west Texas, it's like jumping off the charts of the biodiversity potential and what's there than, like, say, Nacogdoches, right? And to me, when we get to that level where we're really looking at, again, like you said, Brian, the context of that land and the values and and it's about how do we implement the principles to meet the highest potential of that property.
Yep. You could have said it any better.
Um, Man, I could go on and on with you guys and keep talking and, about all this stuff. It's been, just pretty amazing. Uh, how would you guys feel about like jumping on a second podcast and we dive in a little even deeper into some of this?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Happy to bring some studies along too if you want to dive into some of that. I know one of the premier soil scientists in this space, Paige Stanley, has produced a lot of good work on not only the social aspects of thinking about these, but also the actual hard science around soil metrics and measurements. And I think, and we can also bring in some of the work that we've done here at Earth Optics. I know James has kind of alluded to a 16 ranch study that we've done and how those soil metrics have looked across those 16 ranches over the last 3 or 4 years. So yeah, I think we can, if we want to take a hard look at, a particular case study or some actual, hard data around that, I'm happy to bring in some of that as well.
Yeah, no, I would love to do that, Ryan. I mean, kind of maybe to end this podcast, just because we're running out of time, to like, if you had to pick one, if I haven't collected data, right? I'm the landowner, land steward. I hadn't collected anything. It's all in my head. Um, but I'm wanting to try something, right? And I want it to make economic sense for me as well. Um, what's the one to maybe three things that I should start collecting today?
Go ahead, James. I spent enough time talking, I think.
No, if so, and I guess that's one more point that we should probably make too, is that on the carbon credit side,
Yeah.
they our services are paid for by the sale of carbon credits. So a rancher doesn't
Right.
pay for Earth Optics. I tell people I'm a customer of this space. in our second segment as well about what it feels like from the customer side. But the only things I spent money on were 4 different lawyers with lots of experience, all kind of going through as many red lines as I could, which were few on these contracts. But that was the only money paid out of pocket is because I was representing multiple families on these contracts. I had to get sound on that and make sure that we were liability protected. And so, but then as a landowner, I mean, in addition to the carbon side, I mean, the other product is the biology side and the nutrients of the soil. And so like those places where your continuous heifer pastures or hay pastures or horse pastures, like some of the putting those places against some of your more holistically managed part of your operation, your kind of cow calf pastures,
Right.
and just seeing, hey, just because I know that I like this as a hay pasture because it's by the road, it's convenient, my man knows how to cut hay on it, whatever, doesn't mean that that is the best long term. And so, you know, putting even judging your own pastures against each other and seeing what am I doing here that I'm not doing there? What could I be doing there? Uh, and so I think just, the data collection is cheap. And I mean, I tell people like what it costs to gather the information on a ranch is less than any wildlife lease in Texas and probably less than most people are making on a cattle operation. So if you did just want to collect the data, but I think going through and learning all the things where, and then the water infiltration side too, you brought that up in the beginning, Chad, is like, hey, there's the Rome Ranch in Fredericksburg. That's a great couple that bought that place. They bought it from somewhere and they said 100 years of a creek that was basically a dry creek that only was wet in the winter. I mean, only wet after rain. And now that creek is full almost year round. And so, seeing what that water infiltration, seeing what a reduction of your compaction looks like. And so I don't want to point to 3 things, Chad. I guess it's,
Yeah.
letting us talk to you and seeing like, what could we offer to you? And again, if you can sell credits and get the data, that was somebody told me that early on too. Is like, look, whether you choose to not sell credits or not, at least having that data and being able to adjust your stocking rates and your management on that is important too. And so there's a lot of things I guess we can offer
That's
too, but
Yeah, I can't stress that enough, James, right? And it's kind of what I was trying not to get on a soapbox earlier, but the the data and the data collection and that pays for itself, right? It pays for itself in just better management decisions, right?
absolutely.
And then if you can add like carbon markets and other markets to get, other opportunities, that's just like icing on the cake. And I just it just hurts me to see, many of our fellow producers across the country that are struggling. And it's like, man, if you could just do that, then, it could help you in a lot of ways. And it's just hard, right? And that's kind of like I said too. I had to be a little bit more disciplined and really buy into it as well of carving out part of my budget towards data collection, right? And I'm seeing those starting to see those returns on that. And it's just an asset when we think about budgeting. It's not an area that we normally have, right? And we put money towards. So, uh, Ryan, what about your thoughts on like what's the number one, 2, 3 things if you can?
Yeah, no, my suggestion would be, reach out to somebody. It doesn't even have to be us. James and I are happy to have this conversation, but it's never a wrong-headed thing to seek out more information, learn about what's going on. There's lots of people in this industry willing to help and point you in directions that could be useful for your operation. So I would say it's number one, seek out information. Hopefully this podcast will be a good resource for those considering that and an impetus to seek more. Being in this for the last 5 years, I don't see this as a fad or going away. There's lots of interest in this from large entities that are willing to pay top dollar for the right type of data. And so, seeking out that information, figuring out what types of data would be a great first step to take on that. And then beyond that is, um, you know, as you kind of alluded to, there's lots of data provider, or I'm sorry, data services out there. So consider, having something that you can put in your pocket. So instead of your red notebook, maybe you have an app on your phone that's collecting a lot of that information, where you're just tracking pasture movements, or you're tracking calving records, or something along those lines, right? So you have a lot of source, a one-stop shop, so to say, for your data. Centralize that and get it into a form that can be usable, because a lot of these operations that are looking at this data really want to have some type of data collection service provider being used. And then lastly is, don't be afraid to seek out something new. A lot of these entities, like project developers, are willing to partner with you on infrastructure. So if you think, well, I don't have the water, or I don't have the fencing, I would not let that be a deterrent. There's a lot of cost shares out there that could be implemented to even get you started, right? So if you're set stock, or you're very limited in your ability to move cattle, there's probably a program out there that can help you, whether it's with a program developer, or even an equip program at your local NRCS office that is willing to set something up and help you get started. So those would be my top three things.
Great. I appreciate that. Both of y'all's perspectives on this, and just can't stress enough for everybody to just go out there, take something, right? Take, like you said, Brian, I mean, just try something new and start collecting that data. I mean, I really believe in the rangeland space, especially in our grazing space, that the data is another asset, right? It's the next platinum, right? The crop farming land is taking lots of data for many, many years. But there's a lot of companies and other things that data isn't as available or exists. And there's just opportunities in that end as well. So James, Ryan, I mean, I thank you again so much for taking the time to chat with me today. Really, truly appreciate the work you and the Earth Optics team's doing and supporting landowners. And we're excited here at Talt about the opportunities ahead to collaborate even more with you guys. And I'm looking forward to, furthering this conversation in another podcast and diving deeper. I think we need to, keep having this conversation. This is a lot to learn. And it just, takes time, and kind of one layer at a time. It's kind of like an onion, right? We peel that layer across. And so I'm looking forward to that. And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in. And if you'd like to learn more about Texas Agricultural Land Trust, explore our work, or suggest topics for our future episodes, feel free to reach out on our social media, or you can email us at our info@txaglandtrust.org. Appreciate, again, both of you, and have a blessed one.
Beyond the Fence Line is brought to you by the Texas Agricultural Land Trust, dedicated to conserving the Texas heritage of agricultural lands, wildlife habitats, and natural resources. Find out more at txaglandtrust.org.